They say a doctor's hands are their greatest asset, a divine instrument crafted to bridge the gap between life and death. I used to believe that. I believed that if I worked 10 times harder than the children born with silver spoons, if I let my palms crack and bleed from hauling freight at the docks every night just to afford one more dose of chemo for my mother, then justice would eventually smile upon me. I was wrong. It was a mistake so naive it was laughable. 6 years ago, I stood in the dean's office, staring at Julian, the golden boy with a sun-drenched smile and hands that had never known a single callus. He looked at me with such curated pity. He told the police he had tried to help me with my addiction, that it broke his heart to see a brilliant student like me lose his way. I screamed. I swore on my life I had never touched those bottles of I even begged him, genuinely believing there was a shred of friendship between us. I thought Julian was my guardian angel when he offered to cover my mother's medical bills. But as the steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, Julian leaned in. The scent of his expensive cologne hit my nose like the stench of a rotting corpse. He whispered, "Don't be mad, Leo. You're just a sewer rat with the stench of the docks on you. Rats shouldn't hold scalpels. They should die in cages." That day, I lost everything. My honor, my future, and my mother's final breath when she was kicked out of his father's hospital. I vanished. The world thought I had taken my own life, but they were wrong. I used these rat hands to stitch together shattered bodies on the front lines of wars, in lands that don't even exist on a map. And now, Julian is lying on my operating table, his golden hands crushed into something resembling a pile of wet trash. He doesn't recognize me behind this surgical mask. He calls me his savior. How ironic, when your only savior is the very demon you created 6 years ago. They say the human heart is a resilient muscle, but they never tell you how it sounds when it finally snaps. It's not a loud bang. It's a wet, sickening pop, like a piece of overstretched sinew giving up the ghost. I remember that sound vividly as I stood in the middle of the St. Jude's locker room, my hands still smelling of the cheap industrial soap from the Baltimore docks and the faint metallic tang of my mother's medication. I was 23, a straight-A medical student who hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 3 years. My eyes were a roadmap of red veins, and my soul felt like it had been scraped thin with a dull razor. I was so close. Just 1 week away from the residency placement that would change everything. I looked at Julian, standing there in his custom-tailored scrubs that probably cost more than my car, and for a second, I actually thought he was worried about me. He had that look on his face, eyebrows pinched, lips pulled back in a grimace of feigned concern. He looked like an angel, but the kind of angel that enjoys watching the world burn from a safe, air-conditioned distance. My locker was hanging open, the metal door groaning on its hinges like a dying animal. Inside, nestled among my tattered textbooks and a photo of my mother smiling before the chemo took her hair, sat 3 translucent orange bottles. High dosage, enough to kill a horse or ruin a career. I didn't even have time to process the sight before the heavy thud of combat boots echoed down the hallway. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and cold. Julian didn't move. He just stood there, the scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne suffocating the small space. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck, a physical manifestation of the dread pooling in my stomach. When the police officers rounded the corner, Julian didn't flinch. He just sighed, a long theatrical exhale of disappointment that made my skin crawl. He looked at the lead officer and then back at me, his voice dripping with a fake honeyed sadness that felt like lye on an open wound. "Leo, I told you to get help, man. I told you that the stress of the docks was getting to you. But I never thought you'd start stealing from the oncology ward. I tried to cover for you, I really did. But this is too much. You're sick, Leo. You're a liability to every patient in this building." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it had been swallowed by a desert. My tongue was a lead weight. I wanted to scream that I'd never even seen those bottles, that I spent my nights lifting crates, not raiding cabinets. But the words died in my lungs. One of the officers gripped my arm, his fingers digging into the muscle I'd built through years of manual labor. It was a strange irony. The strength I'd cultivated to survive was now being used to restrain me like a common animal. As they began to pull me away, the world blurred into a smear of white tiles and fluorescent lights. Julian leaned in then, his breath warm against my ear, a stark contrast to the icy terror vibrating through my bones. His voice was a low, jagged whisper, stripped of all the public sympathy he'd just performed. "Don't look so surprised, Leo. You really thought a scholarship rat like you could sit at the same table as me? Hands that move crates shouldn't touch human hearts. You belong in the gutter, breathing in the smog and the failure of your bloodline. Go back to the docks and stay there. The world doesn't need doctors like you. It needs people to carry my luggage." He pulled back, a tiny, satisfied smirk playing on the corner of his mouth, as if he'd just finished a particularly fine meal. I watched his polished shoes pivot on the linoleum, walking away with a grace that only comes from never having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. He didn't look back. Why would he? You don't look back at the trash you finally tossed into the bin. My mother was waiting for me at home, her body a frail cage of bones, waiting for the medicine I wouldn't be able to provide anymore, because the man I called my best friend had just set my entire world on fire. The fluorescent lights in the dean's office didn't just illuminate the room, they dissected me. I felt like a specimen pinned to a board, my dignity bleeding out onto the plush Persian rug. My heart was thumping a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird sensing the cat's claws. Across from me sat Dr. Sterling, Julian's father and the chief of surgery at St. Jude's. He didn't look angry. That was the worst part. He looked bored, as if my entire existence was a clerical error he was finally getting around to fixing. He adjusted his silk tie with fingers that had never known the bite of a cold winter or the rough texture of a shipping crate. Beside him, Julia sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking in what any stranger would mistake for grief. But I saw it. The slight tension in his jaw. He wasn't crying. He was vibrating with the sheer ecstatic thrill of the kill. Just an hour ago, I was at the top of the leaderboard. My research on neural regeneration was the talk of the faculty. I had spent 6 months culturing those samples, whispering to them in the dead of night while the rest of the world slept. I remember the smell of the lab, ozone and agar, and the way my hands, despite the exhaustion, were steady as a rock when I held a pipette. But then came the accident. I walked in to find my petri dishes shattered, the life-saving culture smeared across the floor like waste. Julian had been the only one there. He looked at me with those wide, deceptive eyes and said, "Leo, man, you really need to sleep. I saw you stumble and knock the tray over. It's that working-class fatigue. It's finally catching up to your brain." He said it so convincingly that, for a split second, I actually questioned my own reality. That's how gaslighting works. It's a slow-acting poison that makes you doubt the very ground you stand on. Now, standing in this office, the poison had reached my heart. Dr. Sterling tossed a manila folder onto the mahogany desk. It contained the evidence, the stolen narcotics found in my locker, the falsified lab reports, and a testimony from Julian about my erratic behavior and money struggles. I wanted to scream that Julian was the one who had invited me to the oncology wing under the guise of a study session. I wanted to tell them that he was the one who knew exactly when the security cameras in the locker room went dark for maintenance. But the words felt like dry ash in my mouth. My stomach was a knot of acid, the physical manifestation of a betrayal so deep it felt like it had rewritten my DNA. I looked at Julian, hoping for a shred of humanity, but all I found was a void wrapped in a designer suit. Julian finally looked up, his eyes wet with fake tears, a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Dad, please, be easy on him. Leo's had a hard life. He's just desperate to provide for his mom. Maybe he thought he could sell the pills to pay for her chemo. It's not his fault he was born into a world where he has to cheat to keep up with us." The condescension was so thick I could taste it, a metallic, bitter flavor that made me want to gag. He wasn't just accusing me of a crime. He was pathologizing my poverty, turning my struggle into a symptom of my supposed inferiority. He made it sound like my ambition was a disease and he was the only one brave enough to diagnose it. Dr. Sterling stood up, his presence filling the room with an icy, suffocating authority. He didn't even look me in the eye when he spoke. His voice was calm, clipped, and utterly final. St. Jude's has a reputation to uphold, Mr. Thorne. We cultivate excellence here, not desperation. My son tried to be your friend, but you cannot breed a racehorse out of a mule. He stepped closer, finally looking at me, and his gaze was colder than the morgue downstairs. Don't blame anyone but yourself, Leo. Being poor isn't a crime. But being poor and having ambition? That's a trap you set for yourself. You thought you could climb out of the gutter, but all you did was bring the mud into my hospital. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my palms and realized I was clenching my fists so hard my nails were drawing blood. The irony wasn't lost on me. My own blood was the only thing I had left that Julian couldn't steal. I thought about my mother, sitting in our cold apartment, counting the days until my graduation. I thought about the thousands of hours I'd spent bokvak at the docks, my muscles screaming so that I could afford the very textbooks Julian used as coasters for his lattes. It was all gone. In the span of a morning, they had turned my future into a punchline. Have you ever felt the exact moment your soul turns into a cold, hard stone? It's a strange kind of peace. The hope dies, and in its place, something much more dangerous begins to grow. I was escorted out by 2 security guards, their hands heavy on my shoulders as if I were a violent felon. We passed the lecture hall where my name was still listed at the top of the honors roll. We passed the cafeteria where Julian was probably already planning his victory party. As the heavy glass doors of the hospital swung shut behind me, the humid Baltimore air hit me like a physical blow. I stood on the sidewalk, my belongings in a tattered cardboard box, watching the luxury cars pull into the VIP parking lot. I was a ghost in my own life. My mother was dying, my career was a charred ruin, and the man who did it was probably laughing at his own reflection. It's funny, isn't it? How the people who have everything are the ones most obsessed with taking the little you have left. Like a billionaire stealing a nickel from a beggar just because he likes the sound it makes when it hits the ground. Have you ever been so low that the only way to look is up, but all you see is the boot that stepped on you? The cold wasn't just in the air. It was a living thing, crawling under my skin and settling in my marrow. As the security guards marched me through the lobby of St. Jude's, my heels dragged against the polished marble, making a pathetic, screeching sound that echoed like a dying bird. Everyone was watching. The nurses I'd brought coffee to during 30-hour shifts, the juniors I'd tutored for free, they all averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their clipboards or the floor. I could feel the collective weight of their judgment, a heavy, suffocating blanket of, I knew he didn't belong here. The air in that lobby had always smelled like expensive wax and hope, but now it just smelled like ozone and the impending rain. My chest felt hollow, as if someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made me Leo Thorne, leaving behind nothing but a rattling cage of ribs and a heart that refused to stop beating, no matter how much I wanted it to. I reached our apartment in a daze, the cardboard box of my life tucked under one arm. But the nightmare wasn't finished with me. It was just getting its second wind. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a frantic, jagged vibration that made my stomach lurch. It was the hospital's billing department, not the school, the hospital. A woman with a voice as sharp as a paper cut informed me that because of my gross misconduct and criminal association, my mother's compassionate care insurance, a perk tied to my residency track, had been terminated, effective immediately. They didn't care that she was mid-cycle in her treatment. They didn't care that moving her was a death sentence. To them, she wasn't a woman named Sarah who loved old jazz and burnt toast. She was a liability attached to a disgraced student. I raced back to the hospital, not as a doctor in training, but as a beggar. The rain had started, a cold, miserable Baltimore drizzle that turned the soot on the streets into a slick, black sludge. I found her in the hallway. They hadn't even let her stay in the room until I arrived. She was sitting in a wheelchair, her frame so frail it looked like a gust of wind could shatter her. Her skin was the color of old parchment, translucent and gray. When she saw me, she didn't ask what happened. She just reached out with a trembling hand and gripped mine. Her fingers were ice, her nails blue-tinged from the lack of oxygen. "Leo, honey, it's okay," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle that tore through my soul. "We'll go home. I don't like the smell here anyway." She was lying. She was terrified. I could see it in the way her eyes darted toward the exit, where the rain was coming down in silver sheets. The head nurse, a woman who had hugged me when I passed my boards, wouldn't even look at me. She just pointed to a tattered discharge form. "You have 10 minutes to clear the premises, Mr. Thorne. Otherwise, we'll have to call city transit to move her to the municipal shelter." The word shelter hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. I didn't have a car. I had no money left. Every cent had gone into Julian's father's pocket through fees and tuition. In a moment of pure, humiliating desperation, I called an old contact from the docks, a man named Silas, who drove a rusted-out 1998 pickup truck that smelled eternally of diesel and dead fish. Watching Silas help me lift my mother's fragile body into the back of that truck was the moment my dignity finally dissolved. We laid her on a pile of old moving blankets in the truck bed because the cab was too cramped for her to breathe. I climbed in back with her, shielding her body with my own as Silas pulled away from the curb. The rain was relentless now, stinging my eyes and soaking through my clothes, until I was shivering uncontrollably. But my mother, she was beyond shivering. She was just fading. I held her head in my lap, my tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "Just a little longer, Mom," I sobbed, my voice lost in the roar of the engine and the splash of tires on the pavement. "Silas is taking us to the hospice on 4th Street. They'll take care of you." She looked up at me then, her eyes cloudy but filled with a sudden, heartbreaking clarity. She squeezed my hand, a final, desperate surge of strength. "Leo, your hands," she wheezed, her chest heaving as she fought for every molecule of air. "Don't let them make you hate them. You were born to heal." Then, her grip slackened. It wasn't like the movies. There was no final gasp, no poetic last word. Just a long, slow exhale that seemed to take the last of the warmth from her body. The hand that had held mine through every fever, every scraped knee, and every sleepless night of studying fell limp onto the cold, rusted metal of the truck bed. I sat there in the back of that moving truck, cradling her cooling body as we drove through the neon-lit streets of a city that didn't care we existed. The rain continued to fall, washing away the salt from my face, but it couldn't wash away the sudden, terrifying emptiness inside me. I didn't scream. I didn't wail. Something inside me simply went dark, like a candle being snuffed out by a heavy, wet hand. My eyes went dead, fixed on the distant, glowing logo of St. Jude's Hospital, receding in the distance. Julian and his father thought they had destroyed a career. They didn't realize they had birthed a monster. The Leo Thorne who believed in the Hippocratic Oath died in the back of that truck. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a person can keep breathing when their entire world has ended. I felt my heart beating, thump, 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 a senseless, mechanical rhythm that felt like an insult to my mother's silence. I looked at my hands, the ones Julian said were only fit for moving crates. They were covered in grease, rain, and the faint lingering scent of my mother's lavender soap. They were strong. They were capable. And in that moment, I made a silent vow to her, to the cold rain, and to the God who had abandoned me. I would use these hands to build a nightmare so intricate, so beautiful, and so devastating that Julian Sterling would beg for the mercy I was never shown. Have you ever lost the only person who loved you and realized that for the first time in your life, you have absolutely nothing left to lose? Because that is when you become truly dangerous. Like and subscribe if you think Leo's revenge should be merciless. The pawn shop in downtown Baltimore smelled like desperation and old copper. I laid my medical textbooks on the counter, the Gray's Anatomy with my mother's handwritten notes in the margins, the neurosurgery guides I had memorized until the pages frayed. The man behind the glass offered me $300. It was the price of my soul, or at least the paper version of it. I didn't haggle. I took the cash, bought a one-way ticket to a place the news anchors only spoke about in hushed, somber tones, and walked away from the wreckage of Leo Thorne without looking back. I didn't need books anymore. I needed scars. 6 months later, the smell of lavender soap was a distant, mocking memory. Now, my world was defined by the scent of cordite, burning rubber, and the cloying metallic rot of a field hospital in a desert that didn't even have a name on the maps. My clinic was a repurposed shipping container, the very kind I used to move at the docks. Irony is a cruel mistress, isn't it? The sun beat down on the corrugated metal until the air inside was thick enough to chew, a soup of dust and iron. I didn't have a license. I didn't have a clean scrub suite. I had a rusted basin of boiled water, a collection of sewing needles, and a set of daggers I had sharpened until they could slice through a falling hair. I remember my first patient in the zone, a boy no older than 10, with a piece of shrapnel embedded in his femoral artery. He was screaming, a high-pitched, jagged sound that cut through the whistle of distant mortars. We had no anesthesia, no morphine, nothing but a leather strap for him to bite on, and my hands. My hands, which Julian said were too thick for surgery, were now the only thing standing between this boy and a body bag. I felt the heat radiating from his wound, the rhythmic spurt of hot crimson blood soaking through my apron until it felt like a heavy wet skin. My vision tunneled. The chaos outside, the shouting, the explosions, the dust, it all faded into a singular sharp point of focus. I wasn't just a man. I was a needle, threading the line between life and death. It was in those frantic, blood-soaked hours that I discovered it. The neural suture technique. In the civilized world of St. Jude's, they used microscopic cameras and robotic arms to repair nerve damage. Here, I had nothing but a magnifying glass with a crack down the center and tent thread so fine it was almost invisible. I began to realize that if I bypassed the traditional suture points and wove the thread through the nerve casing in a specific triple braid pattern, the signal could jump the gap. It was a miracle born of pure, unadulterated necessity. I was playing God with a sewing needle, and a prayer I didn't believe in. Each time I succeeded, I felt a cold, sharp spark of triumph. I wasn't just healing people. I was perfecting a weapon. I was forging a skill that the pampered princes like Julian could never buy, no matter how much of their daddy's money they threw at it. There were nights when the mortars felt so close that the shipping container would groan, the metal walls vibrating against my spine. I would sit in the dark, my fingers cramped into claws, and I would practice. I practiced on scraps of leather, on orange peels, on the veins of dead leaves. I pushed myself until my eyes burned and my tremors returned, not from lack of sleep, but from a terrifying, singular intensity. I became a shadow doctor, a ghost that moved between the tents. People didn't know my name, but they knew my hands. They called me Al-Jada, the surgeon. They didn't care that I had been kicked out of a fancy school in America. They only cared that when I touched them, the bleeding stopped, and the feeling returned to their limbs. I remember looking at my reflection in a bucket of bloody water one night. My face was gaunt, my beard matted with dust, my eyes sunken into hollow pits of shadow. I looked like a man who had crawled out of his own grave. I laughed then, a dry, hacking sound that felt like sandpaper in my throat. If Julian could see me now, he'd probably vomit in his silk loafers. He thought he'd sent me to the gutter to die. He didn't realize that in the gutter, you learn how to breathe underwater. He was back in Baltimore, probably sipping champagne and celebrating a successful bypass surgery on some senator, while I was here, learning how to stitch a man's soul back together in the middle of a hurricane. The permanent metallic scent of blood had become my second skin. It was in my hair, under my nails, in the pores of my face. It was a reminder of what I had lost and what I was becoming. I wasn't Leo the scholarship boy anymore. I was a master of the macabre, a virtuoso of the desperate. Every life I saved was a payment into a bank account of vengeance that was growing at an astronomical rate. I was waiting. I was learning. I was becoming the only person in the world who could do what I did. Because I knew, with a certainty that burned hotter than the desert sun, that one day, Julian Sterling would find himself in a position where all the money and prestige in the world wouldn't be enough to save him. He would need a miracle, and I was the only one who knew how to sow one. Tell me, if you were me, would you have stayed in that desert forever? Or would you have come back for the man who took your mother's life? The desert night was a vast obsidian silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of a radio or the distant, rhythmic thump of a generator. My patient that night was a man they called Ghost, a mercenary with a torso like a roadmap of old shrapnel and a fresh, jagged hole in his shoulder that was weeping dark, venous blood. He had a rugged satellite laptop clutched to his chest, even as he drifted in and out of consciousness. While I worked on him, my daggers moving with a cold, surgical grace to debride the wound, his delirious rambling caught my ear. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a specialist in digital acquisition, a hacker for hire in a world of sand and fire. "I can get you anything," he wheezed as I threaded a needle with my signature tent thread. "Just don't let me lose the arm." I didn't care about his money or his secrets, but as I looked at the flickering screen of his laptop, a thought, a cold, sharp needle of an idea, pierced my brain. 3 days later, once his fever broke and he could sit up, Ghost repaid his debt. He didn't give me gold. He gave me the keys to the kingdom I had been exiled from. He bypassed the firewalls of St. Jude's Hospital like they were made of wet tissue paper, pulling encrypted cloud data from the administration's black folder. I sat in the corner of that sweltering shipping container, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my sunken eyes, and I watched my life be dismantled all over again. I had always thought Julian was a lone wolf, a jealous, spoiled brat acting on impulse. I was wrong. The logs showed a series of emails between Julian and his father, Dr. Sterling, dated weeks before my arrest. "Leo is the only obstacle," Julian had written. "His scores are too high. I can't beat him on merit." The reply from Dr. Sterling chilled me more than the desert wind ever could. "Merit is for those without resources, Julian. I will handle the pharmacy logs. Ensure the bottles are in his locker by 0800. I've already spoken to the insurance board. If he's flagged for narcotics, his mother's coverage will be auto-terminated. It's a clean break." I felt a sudden violent surge of nausea. It wasn't just a frame-up. It was a death warrant. They hadn't just stolen my career. They had weaponized my mother's illness to ensure I would be too broken to fight back. They knew she would die. They had calculated her final breaths into their profit and loss margins. My rage, which had been a screaming hot fire for years, suddenly underwent a terrifying chemical change. It turned into liquid nitrogen, clear, silent, and capable of shattering anything it touched. I didn't want to kill them. Death was too quick, too merciful. I wanted to erase them, the same way they had tried to erase me. "Ghost," I said, my voice sounding like grinding stones. "I need a new soul. I need a name that commands respect in every surgical theater, from London to Tokyo, and I need it to be untouchable. Over the next few months, with Ghost's help, Dr. L. Thorne was born. We didn't just create a fake ID, we built a legend. We backdated research papers into prestigious European journals. We leaked reports of a reclusive genius operating in high-altitude trauma centers and war zones, a man who had perfected the impossible neural suture. I spent my meager savings on high-end medical equipment, shipping it to a dummy clinic in Switzerland. I became a ghost within a ghost. Leo Thorne was a dead junkie in a Baltimore file. Dr. L. Thorne was the most sought-after trauma specialist in the world, a man who never showed his face on camera and only communicated through encrypted channels. I practiced my American accent until the grit of the desert was gone, replaced by a refined mid-Atlantic clip that sounded like old money and expensive education. I began to dress in charcoal grays and blacks, the colors of a funeral. Every night, I would look at the photo of my mother, the one I had saved from the pawn shop. I would touch the neural suture I had practiced on a scrap of goat hide and whisper to the darkness. They think they are the masters of the hospital, Mom, but they forgot one thing. A hospital is a place of pain, and nobody knows pain better than I do. The irony was delicious. I was using the very ambition Dr. Sterling had called a trap to build a cage for him. I wasn't a mule anymore. I was a wolf in a lab coat, and I was scenting the air for the smell of Julian's inevitable failure. Because a man like Julian, built on lies and plagiarized success, is like a building with a cracked foundation. Eventually, the weight of his own ego would cause him to snap. And when he did, when the golden boy finally broke his toy, he would go looking for the only man who could fix it. I started tracking St. Jude's financial reports. They were over-leveraged, betting big on a new robotic surgery wing that was bleeding money. They needed a miracle. They needed a superstar. I sat back in the shadows, my scarred hands steady, and waited for the first crack to appear in the Sterling dynasty. Have you ever spent years building a masterpiece just so you could watch someone else's world burn? It's a very specific kind of satisfaction. Like this video if you think Dr. Thorne is the ultimate mastermind. 6 years. 2,190 days of breathing in the dust of the forgotten so that I could return to the world of the remembered. I stepped off the plane in Geneva, my charcoal overcoat feeling like a suit of armor. The air here was crisp, sterile, and smelled of wealth, a sharp, jarring contrast to the metallic tang of the desert. I looked at my hands. The calluses from the bentao were gone, replaced by the supple, sensitive skin of a man who spent his life handling silk sutures and microscalpels. I wasn't Leo Thorne anymore. I was a phantom, wrapped in a $5,000 suit, a whisper in the ears of the world's medical elite. While I was building a legend out of shadows, Julian was building a monument to his own vanity. I sat in a high-end lounge, sipping an espresso that cost more than a week's worth of my mother's old medication, and flipped through Modern Surgeon. There he was, Julian Sterling. His face was smoother, his smile more practiced, his hair perfectly coiffed for the cameras. The headline read, "The Golden Hands, How Julian Sterling is Revolutionizing Neural Repair." I felt a cold, dry chuckle rattle in my throat. I knew exactly how he was revolutionizing it. Ghost had tracked his internal hospital communications. Julian was a vampire, sucking the brilliance out of his underpaid residents, slapping his name on their breakthroughs, and then tossing them aside. He was a fraud, a hollow shell of a doctor, held together by his father's PR machine and a senator's daughter on his arm. He was set to marry Madeline Vance in 3 months, a union that would solidify the Sterling name in the political stratosphere. But underneath the gala invitations and the glossy covers, the foundation was rotting. St. Jude's Hospital, once the crown jewel of Baltimore, was hemorrhaging cash. Dr. Sterling had gambled everything on a fleet of AI-driven surgical robots that were plagued by software glitches and malpractice suits. They were desperate for a bailout, a secret infusion of capital to keep the doors open before the IPO. This was where Dr. L. Thorne stepped into the light, or rather, the deep shade. Using the millions I had accumulated through Ghost's untraceable investments and my own exorbitant consulting fees for billionaires, I formed a venture capital firm called Lachesis Holdings, named after the Greek fate who measures the thread of life. We didn't just invest in St. Jude's, we began cleaning up their toxic debt. Every time Dr. Sterling took a high-interest loan to cover a lawsuit, I was the one on the other side of the contract, disguised behind a dozen shell companies. I was buying his hospital, brick by brick, soul by soul, and he was thanking me for the partnership. I began publishing my case studies from the conflict zone, but I scrubbed the locations. I presented them as advanced field trials in high-stress neural reconstruction. I used the neural suture bypass as my calling card. The medical world went into a frenzy. Who was this Dr. Thorne? Why did he refuse to attend conferences? Why was his only address a secure server in Switzerland? I became the great white whale of neurosurgery. I watched from my monitors as Julian's name began to fade from the journals, replaced by questions about whether he could replicate the Thorne technique. I could see the panic in his eyes during his televised interviews, the way he'd wipe sweat from his brow when a reporter asked for his opinion on my latest paper. I remember one specific evening, sitting in my darkened office in Zurich, watching a live stream of a charity gala at St. Jude's. Julian was on stage, boasting about their new Center for Excellence. He looked so confident, so untouchable. I leaned forward, my face inches from the screen, and whispered, "Enjoy the view, Julian. It's a long way down." I sent an encrypted message to the hospital's board of directors that night. I offered them a deal. Lachesis Holdings would forgive 40% of their debt in exchange for an exclusive research partnership and a seat on the executive board for my designated representative. They jumped at it like starving dogs. They were so blinded by the money that they didn't even check the fine print. They didn't see the clause that gave me total administrative oversight in the event of a surgical failure by a primary staff member. They were inviting the executioner into their home and offering him the best seat at the table. I felt a strange, detached kind of joy. It wasn't the hot and messy happiness I used to feel with my mother. It was the clinical satisfaction of a surgeon who has successfully removed a tumor. I was no longer just a ghost. I was the landlord of their nightmares. I started leaked rumors to the press about Julian's failing success rate with the robots. I watched his stock prices dip. I watched the senator's daughter start to look less adoring in photos. I was tightening the noose, millimeter by millimeter. Julian thought he had won when he sent me to the gutter. He thought the story ended when the truck pulled away with my mother's body. He didn't realize that was only the prologue. The stage was set, the debt was bought. The legend of Dr. Thorne was at its zenith. All I needed now was for Julian to do what he does best, make a catastrophic mistake. And I knew exactly how to nudge him toward the edge. It's funny, isn't it? How easy it is to destroy a man when you know exactly what he's afraid of. Julian was afraid of being ordinary. I was going to make him a legend, for all the wrong reasons. I have the hospital in my pocket, and the man who ruined me is begging for my ghost's help. Would you take the money and run, or stay to see the look on his face? The rainy streets of Baltimore had always been a graveyard for my memories, but tonight they were a stage. I sat in the back of a blacked-out sedan, parked 2 blocks away from the exclusive Solstice Gala. I wasn't watching the red carpet. I was watching a telemetry feed on my tablet. Julian had always been a creature of habit, predictable in his arrogance. Every time he felt slighted, every time a medical journal praised Dr. Thorne instead of him, he would drown his ego in 3 fingers of expensive scotch and climb into his Ferrari. He drove like he lived, fast, reckless, and with a delusional belief that the laws of physics didn't apply to a Sterling. The crash didn't sound like a tragedy. It sounded like a dull, metallic crunch, followed by the tinkling of glass that reminded me of my mother's medicine vials breaking on our kitchen floor. My heart didn't race, it slowed down. I watched the emergency lights begin to dance against the wet brick walls in the distance. Julian's hands, those golden hands, that had never known the bite of a winter's night at the docks, were currently pinned between the steering column and a reinforced concrete divider. The irony was poetic. The very machine he used to flaunt his status had become his shackles. By the time the ambulance reached St. Jude's, I was already listening to the chaos in the ER through a patched-in audio feed. Dr. Sterling's voice was a jagged shriek, stripped of all its cold boardroom authority. "Save them! Do you hear me? If he can't operate, you're all finished!" I could hear the frantic murmurs of the senior surgeons. I knew exactly what they were seeing: comminuted fractures of the carpals, severed median and ulnar nerves, and a vascular mess that looked like a bird's nest made of raw meat. In the medical world, we call this a career ender. To me, it was justice in the form of shattered bone. I spent the next 4 hours in my hotel suite, watching the shadow play of the city lights on my ceiling. I knew the phone would ring. I had positioned Lacus's Holdings as the hospital's only lifeline, and Dr. Thorne as the only god who could perform miracles. When the call finally came at 3 a.m., it wasn't a secretary. It was Dr. Sterling himself. His voice was trembling, a pathetic, wet sound that made me smile in the dark. "Dr. Thorne? Please. I know it's late. I know you value your privacy. But my son, Julian Sterling, he's had an accident. The best surgeons in the country are saying he'll lose his motor function. They say only you have the technique to bridge the nerve gaps." I let the silence stretch, long and agonizing. I wanted him to feel the vacuum, the same way I felt when he told me my mother's insurance was gone. "Dr. Sterling," I said, my voice modulated through a distortion filter to sound like a gravelly, untraceable rasp. "I am a very busy man. My time is spent on those who have a future. Is your son truly worth the effort?" "Money is no object," he cried out, and I could hear the desperation cracking his throat. "I'll pay 10 times your fee. I'll give your firm whatever oversight it wants. Just save his hands. He's a genius, Dr. Thorne. The world needs his gift." A genius? A gift? I felt a surge of cold, dark humor. The gift was a lie built on my stolen sweat, and the genius was a fraud I had nurtured just to watch him fall. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the glowing red cross of the St. Jude sign on the horizon. My palms ached with a phantom memory of the crates I used to carry, the rough wood biting into my skin, while Julian laughed in the climate-controlled halls. "I will come," I said, each word a cold drop of water. "But not for money. I want total control of the surgical theater. No observers except through a secured live stream for the board. And I want the contract signed in blood, metaphorically speaking. If I fail, Lacus's Holdings takes full ownership of the hospital. If I succeed, you owe me a debt that can never be repaid in currency. Yes, anything. Just get here." I hung up the phone. My reflection in the window showed a man who had no soul left to sell, only a debt to collect. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, velvet-lined case. Inside were the daggers I had sharpened in the desert and the tent thread I had used to stitch together the broken bodies of soldiers. They were crude, they were scarred, and they were about to perform the most delicate, most devastating surgery in the history of Baltimore. The lion was finally inviting the hunter into his den, thinking he was a savior. He had no idea that the miracle I was about to perform would be the most exquisite torture he had ever endured. Have you ever walked into a room knowing you held the power of life and death over the person who destroyed you? It's a weight that would break a lesser man, but for me, it felt as light as a feather. The digital interface on Dr. Sterling's end must have looked like a portal into a dark, sterile void. I sat in my darkened hotel room, the glow from my laptop casting long, skeletal shadows across the walls. My face was obscured by a sophisticated digital blur, and my voice was a synthesized, low-frequency hum that sounded more like a machine than a man. On the other end of the line, in the high-tech boardroom of St. Jude's, Dr. Sterling looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, his silk shirt wrinkled, and his hands, the elder version of the hands that had ruined me, were trembling as they clutched a gold-plated pen. "Dr. Thorne, we've prepared Theater 4. Our best nursing staff is on standby. The robots are calibrated. We are ready for you," he said, his voice cracking with a desperate, servile hope. "No," I replied, the word cutting through his babbling like a cold scalpel. "Theater 4 is for the masses. I want Theater 9, the old wing, the one with the observation gallery that hasn't been used in a decade." I watched him freeze through the camera. Theater 9. The exact room where, 6 years ago, security had pinned me against the wall while Julian whispered his poison into my ear. It was a dusty relic of the hospital's past, but for me, it was the altar of my rebirth. "Theater 9?" he stammered. "But the equipment there it's antiquated. We have the new AI assistants in the new wing." "I do not work with toys, Dr. Sterling. I work with skill. You will move the patient to Theater 9. You will also ensure a high-bandwidth satellite uplink. This surgery will be live-streamed, unedited, to the Global Medical Board. If I am to save your son's legendary hands, the world should see the technique that makes it possible. It is for educational purposes." The irony was a physical weight in my chest. Educational purposes. The same phrase they used when they expelled me, claiming my case would serve as a lesson to other students about the dangers of working-class desperation. Dr. Sterling hesitated, his instinct for secrecy warring with his terror of Julian's permanent disability. But he looked at the medical reports on his desk, the scans showing Julian's nerves shredded like wet ribbons, and he broke. He signed the electronic contract, the digital ink sealing a fate he couldn't possibly understand. Once the call ended, the room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. I walked over to the bed where my surgical kit lay open. It wasn't the gleaming, silver-plated set of a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon. It was a roll of scarred leather, stained with the dust of the desert and the salt of the sea. I began to sharpen my daggers. The sound, shk, 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 was rhythmic, a heartbeat for a man who had forgotten how to feel. I checked my needles. I checked the spool of tent thread, that impossibly fine black line that had been the only thing holding together the shattered bodies of soldiers and shipping containers. These tools had seen the worst of humanity. They had smelled the rot of infection and the copper of fresh wounds in the dark. They were forged in a war zone, and tonight, they were coming home to finish a war of their own. I ran my thumb along the edge of the blade I'd used to save Ghost. It was sharp enough to split a nerve and cold enough to freeze a soul. I wasn't just preparing for a surgery, I was preparing for an exorcism. I was going to reach into Julian's shattered wrist and pull out the truth, one microscopic stitch at a time. I looked at my own hands. They were steady, no tremors, no fear. I thought about the way Julian used to look at them, with a disgusted, flinching pity. He called them thick. He called them dirty. Tonight, those dirty hands were the only bridge between him and a life of useless, withered limbs. I wondered, as he lay there in the ICU, drugged and broken, did he dream of me? Did he feel the shadow of the scholarship rat looming over his golden future? The hospital was buzzing like a disturbed hive. The Global Medical Board was already logging into the stream, curious about the mysterious Dr. Thorne. The elite of the surgical world were tuning in to see a miracle. Little did they know, they were about to witness a public execution of a reputation. I put on my charcoal gray scrubs, the fabric stiff and cold. I pulled the mask over my face. I was no longer a person. I was a consequence. Is it wrong to feel this much peace before a storm? I felt like a conductor stepping onto the podium, the baton in my hand, waiting for the first note of a symphony of retribution. The world thinks they are about to see the peak of medical science. They have no idea they are about to see the depth of a man's memory. Like this video if you think Julian deserves to feel the fear Leo felt 6 years ago. The air in Theater 9 was thick with the smell of dust and floor wax, a scent that hadn't changed in 6 years. The overhead surgical lights roared to life, a blinding artificial sun that made the shadows in the corners of the room cower. Under that glare, Julian looked like a broken porcelain doll. He was under local anesthesia, his body paralyzed from the neck down, to ensure his heart rate remained stable, but his mind was wide awake, floating in a cocktail of sedatives and his own bloated ego. I stepped through the double doors, the swish of my gown sounding like a blade through silk. My movements were mechanical, a ritual of precision honed in the dark. I didn't look at the cameras, but I knew they were there, the silent, digital eyes of the world's most elite surgeons, watching from 3 different continents. I also knew Dr. Sterling was in the observation gallery, his face pressed against the glass like a desperate ghost. I ignored him. My focus was on Julian's right wrist, which looked like a landscape of raw meat and shattered white bone. It was a mess that would have made any other surgeon's stomach turn. To me, it was a familiar map of pain. I reached for my first tool, a hand-forged, ultrafine microscalpel. As I made the first incision to debride the necrotic tissue, Julian started to speak. His voice was slurred, a wet, rambling sound that filled the sterile room. "You see?" he whispered, his eyes rolling back in his head as he stared at the ceiling. I'm the chosen one. Look at Thorne. He's here to save me. Even a god like him knows my hands are a national treasure. God wouldn't let these hands die. He couldn't. He let out a weak, delirious chuckle that sent a shiver of disgust through my spine. I was born to be a king. I was born to rule St. Jude's. Not like that gutter trash Leo Thorne. Do you remember him, Dad? The scholarship rat? He thought he was my equal. He thought his merit mattered. Where is he now? Probably rotting in a grave or a prison cell, while the world's best surgeon is literally stitching my soul back together. Every word he spoke was a drop of acid on a raw nerve. I didn't flinch. I began the neural suture bypass, my fingers moving with a speed that the live stream cameras could barely capture. I was weaving the tent thread through the median nerve, a triple braid pattern that looked like a spider's web made of midnight. The Global Medical Board must have been gasping at their screens. Nobody had ever seen a nerve repaired with this level of intricacy, especially not with tools that looked like they belonged in a museum of ancient warfare. He was so pathetic, Julian continued, his voice growing louder, more arrogant as the morphine surged. Crying about his mother, begging for a second chance. It was hilarious. I took his life, and I didn't even break a sweat. I just brushed him off like a speck of lint on my jacket. Because that's what people like us do, right, Dr. Thorne? We survive. We win. The losers? They just disappear. I felt the heat of the surgical lamps on my neck. I felt the weight of my daggers in the kit beside me. I was inches away from his face, my mask just a few centimeters from his ear. I could have ended it right there. A slip of the wrist, a severed artery, and Julian Sterling would be a memory. But that was too simple. I wanted him to see the face of the loser who was holding his entire future in 10 scarred fingers. I wanted the world to hear the confession he didn't even know he was making. I moved to the ulnar nerve, the most delicate part of the reconstruction. My hands were so steady they felt like they were made of stone. Julian's rambling had become a soundtrack to my vengeance, a rhythmic reminder of why I had crawled through hell to get back to this room. He was still talking about his royalty, still mocking the memory of my mother, unaware that the very man he was insulting was the one currently threading his destiny back together. I looked up at the observation glass. Dr. Sterling was grinning, a look of immense relief on his face as he watched my progress. He thought the golden boy was being restored. He thought the Sterling legacy was being saved. He had no idea that I wasn't just repairing nerves. I was setting the fuse. I was about to give them exactly what they asked for. A miracle. But miracles, I've learned, always come with a price that can't be paid in gold. The climax of the surgery arrived like a bated breath. On the monitors, the Global Medical Board was witnessing a masterpiece. The nerves were connected, the blood flow restored. But then, my hands, those thick dock worker hands, simply stopped. I froze in mid-motion, a needle still hovering over Julian's open flesh. The silence that rushed into the theater was absolute, heavy enough to crush the lungs. In the observation gallery, I saw Dr. Sterling lean forward, his knuckles white against the glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. I didn't look up. I reached into the sterile pocket of my charcoal gown and pulled out a small laminated photograph. It was the last one ever taken of my mother, pale, skeletal, but smiling with a kindness that Julian's world could never produce. I leaned over and placed the photo directly onto Julian's chest, right over his heart, which was thumping beneath a surgical drape. Julian's eyes, glazed with sedatives but still capable of focus, darted down. He saw the face of the woman he had effectively murdered to save his own ego. Then, I reached for the loops of my surgical mask. I untied them slowly, the fabric falling away to reveal a face that had been forged in desert heat and tempered by a decade of ice-cold hatred. I leaned down until my lips were inches from Julian's ear, the microphone on my lapel catching every syllable for the thousands watching the live stream. "Look at me, Julian," I whispered, the rasp of my voice cutting through the hum of the heart monitor. Julian's pupils dilated until they were nothing but bottomless pits of terror. The drug-induced fog cleared in an instant, replaced by a primal, jagged shock. His jaw worked soundlessly, his breath hitching in his chest. He recognized the gutter trash. He recognized the man he thought he had buried under a pile of rusted crates. "The rat is back, Julian," I said, my voice as steady as the blade I had used to save his useless hands. "And today, I'm not just repairing your nerves. I'm performing the most important operation of my career, the dissection of the truth." I looked up at the observation gallery. Dr. Sterling was standing now, his mouth open in a silent scream of realization. He realized that he hadn't hired a savior. He had invited the ghost of his greatest sin into the very heart of his empire. I turned back to the camera, staring directly into the lens that was broadcasting to the most powerful medical minds on the planet. "Members of the board," I said, my voice echoing in the hollowed halls of Theater 9. "You have just witnessed the Thorne technique. But what you haven't seen is the original lab logs from 6 years ago, the ones that prove Julian Sterling and his father manufactured a narcotics scandal to eliminate a top-tier student. You haven't seen the insurance records they falsified to kill a dying woman. But you're about to." Julian tried to thrash, his body fighting the paralytic agents, his eyes bulging with a frantic animalistic desperation. He wanted to scream, to deny, to hide, but he was trapped in the very miracle he had begged for. I stood over him, the photograph of my mother rusting on his chest like a judge's gavel. "You said hands that move crates shouldn't touch human hearts," I whispered, the irony sweet and heavy on my tongue. "But it turns out, Julian, that the hands you despised are the only reason you still have a future. Too bad that future is about to become a prison." I didn't wait for him to respond. With a flick of my wrist, I activated the theater's primary display system, the one Julian usually used to show off his fraudulent successes. But the screen didn't show a heartbeat or a brain scan. It flickered to life with grainy black and white security footage from 6 years ago. The Global Medical Board, still connected to the high-definition feed, watched in stunned silence as a younger, more arrogant Dr. Sterling walked into a pharmacy storage room, his movements furtive and panicked. They watched him hand a vial of to Julian, whispering instructions on how to plant it in my locker. The audio logs followed, Ghost's masterpiece of digital restoration. Dr. Sterling's voice, unmistakable and cold, filled the room. The insurance termination is already set, Julian. Once the narcotics hit his record, the mother is out. He'll be too busy burying her to worry about his residency. It's a clean break. Julian's breath hitched into a sobbing, pathetic whine. He was awake enough to see his world dissolving into a million digital fragments. In the observation gallery, Dr. Sterling lost his composure entirely. He began pounding on the glass, his face turning a sickly, mottled purple, as he screamed muffled curses that no one cared to hear. He tried to bolt for the theater doors, to stop the broadcast, but he was met by 4 men in suits, security professionals I had hired through Latches' Holdings months ago. They didn't move. They stood like stone sentinels, blocking the man who thought he owned the world. Your empire was built on a foundation of bone and grief, Dr. Sterling, I said, looking up at him through the glass. And today, the rent is due. I turned back to Julian. I picked up the needle one last time, my movements a graceful, terrifying dance of finality. I finished the last suture of a neural bypass with a flourish that was more like a signature on a death warrant. There, I whispered, leaning so close that my mask brushed his forehead. Technically, your hands are perfect, Julian. The nerves are aligned, the blood is flowing. I've given you back the golden hands you loved so much. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in as the chat feed from the Global Medical Board scrolled past on the side monitor. Calls for immediate license revocation, demands for a criminal investigation, and expressions of pure, unadulterated horror. But here is the truth of your miracle, I continued, my voice dripping with a cold, ironic satisfaction. You will never hold a scalpel again, not because you can't, but because no hospital on this planet will ever let you pass the front door. You are a pariah, a fraud, a murderer in a white coat. Every time you look at these hands, I want you to remember that they were saved by the gutter trash you tried to destroy. And every time you feel a chill in your fingers, I want you to know it's not a surgical error. It's the ghost of my mother, making sure you never forget whose blood paid for your second chance. I stepped back, dropping my blood-stained gloves onto the floor. Julian's eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling, weeping silent, terrified tears. He had his hands back, but he had lost his soul, his career, and his name. The grand reversal was complete. The king was a beggar, and the beggar was the architect of his ruin. Like and subscribe if you think Julian's father should spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. The heavy double doors of Theater 9 swung open, and I stepped out into the hallway, not as a fugitive, but as a ghost who had finally reclaimed his pulse. I didn't stay for the aftermath in the operating room. I didn't need to see Julian's silent, shaking tears, or hear the frantic buzzing of the global board members. I walked down the long, sterile corridors of St. Jude's, my charcoal scrubs billowing behind me like a shroud. The hospital felt different now. The walls, once a fortress of exclusion, felt thin, fragile, and ready to buckle under the weight of the truth. As I reached the grand lobby, the same marble cathedral where security had pinned me to the floor 6 years ago, the loop finally closed. The air was thick with the scent of rain from the open doors and the sharp, ozone smell of 100 camera flashes. Dr. Sterling and Julian, the latter strapped into a high-tech gurney with his hands swaddled in bandages, were being escorted by federal agents. The senator's daughter was nowhere to be seen. She had vanished the moment the live stream turned into a confession. I stood by a tall granite pillar, watching as the handcuffs clicked into place around Dr. Sterling's wrists. The sound was a sharp, metallic echo of the night my mother died in the rain. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time. There was no boredom in his eyes now, only a raw, jagged hollow of ruin. He was being dragged away in the exact same flurry of flashing lights and public shame he had used to bury me. Within 48 hours, the Sterling dynasty was a charred memory. St. Jude's Hospital, already hollowed out by their greed and my secret debt acquisitions, collapsed into bankruptcy. Latches' holdings moved in like a silent, surgical strike. We didn't just buy the building, we gutted the name. I signed the final papers in the very office where Dr. Sterling had called me a mule. I didn't want the mahogany desk or the view of the city. I wanted the mission. By the end of the month, the gold-plated St. Jude sign was hauled down and replaced with a simple, sturdy plaque. The Sarah Thorne Medical Center, a free clinic specializing in trauma and chronic care for the dock workers, the stevedores, and the scholarship rats of Baltimore. A week later, I drove out to the small, quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass a deep, vibrant green, and the air smelling of damp earth and cedar. I stood before my mother's headstone, the marble cool under my touch. I wasn't wearing a $5,000 suit or charcoal scrubs. I was wearing an old flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the faint silver scars from my time in the desert. I reached into my bag and pulled out my very first white coat, the one I had pawned all those years ago to buy a ticket to a war zone. I had tracked it down to a dusty shop in Switzerland and bought it back for 1,000 times what it was worth. I folded it carefully and laid it across the base of her grave. It was a white flag of a different kind, not a surrender, but a peace treaty with my own past. I looked down at my hands. They were still rough. The calluses from the Ben Tao were faint but present, a permanent map of where I had come from. They were the hands of a bokvak, a soldier, a ghost, and a healer. For years, I thought they were instruments of vengeance, tools meant only to tear down the people who had hurt me. But as I stood there in the quiet sunlight, I realized the truth. Vengeance had only been the catalyst. These hands hadn't just destroyed the Sterlings. They had rebuilt a life. They had saved the boy in the desert. They had protected the broken. And in the end, they had carried me back to the only person who ever truly believed in them. I felt a strange, light warmth spread through my chest, a sensation so unfamiliar I almost didn't recognize it as a smile. It wasn't the cold, sharp satisfaction of the operating room. It was a quiet, humming joy. I was Leo Thorne. I was a doctor. And for the first time in 6 years, I could breathe without the scent of rust and blood clogging my lungs. I turned away from the grave and walked toward the car, my footsteps steady on the gravel. I had a clinic to run. I had patients waiting. And unlike Julian, my hands didn't need to be golden to be worth something. They just needed to be mine. The best revenge isn't just living well or taking their money. It's becoming the person they said you could never be, and using that power to heal the world they tried to break.